In this week's In-Ear Insights, we have been talking, and everyone has been talking about large language models, the tools that power things like ChatGPT forever and ever. And one of the things that we want to be cognizant of is not losing sight of the fact that the workhorse of machine learning and AI is typically around good old, almost boring analytics data. How do we use these newfangled, fashionable tools with data that still runs our businesses? So, Katie, when you think about analytics data, what are the kinds of data that might want to be able to ask a language model about? And then we can talk through some of the use cases. I did a talk recently with our friends over at Martech, martech.org, about using language models with analytics data.
Well, I'm glad we're talking about analytics data because I feel like large language models and generative AI have overtaken the conversations in a way that we have been distracted and almost forgotten that things like our analytics data are what power the business, are what help us make decisions, and that without it, these other pieces, these shiny objects, are just that. Um, so when I think about analytics data, obviously I think about my website data, things like a Google Analytics or an Adobe Analytics or a Matomo, telling me what's happening within my website and that ecosystem. But then I also think about like my CRM data. What are people opening and what are people ignoring and what's causing someone to unsubscribe or decide that they want to stick around. And then the third piece is my sales and revenue data. So those would be the three pieces that I would look at. I guess when I talk about website data, it's there's a bigger bucket. There's the actual digital marketing data that a lot of different things go into, sort of the marketing automation, our email data, there's our website data, there's social data, there's a lot of other pieces. So all of the things that tell me what's happening with our digital footprint is what I care about. And then also my revenue.
Well, that makes good sense. In fact, in the talk we gave last week about this stuff, we talked specifically about some of those things. So much so that we actually did some demonstrations with synthetic CRM data. And there's sort of six broad categories that we talk about all the time with language models: generation, aka making stuff; extraction, getting data out of things; summarizing stuff; rewriting stuff; classifying stuff; and then answering questions about stuff. And CRM data is one of those pools of data that is incredibly valuable, very rich, and no one uses it. No one uses it, and they should.
They should. I remember, Chris, probably about this time last year, you and I went through an extensive requirements gathering phase of how to build out more sophisticated reports from our CRM data. This was prior to systems like Claude and ChatGPT hitting the mainstream market. So, maybe in a different episode, we can talk about how our approach to those requirements or approach to the execution might have changed. But that's exactly it. We are not using our CRM data to its fullest extent because of the reporting limitations from the system itself. But I'm wondering now, like, what could we do using some of these large language models?
And that's exactly kind of what we showed. And I'll just show a very quick demo here, just to give people a sense of what you could do. So
Mhm.
in ChatGPT, the paid version under GPT-4, there's a tool called Code Interpreter, which is horrendously named. It really should be called like Junior Data Scientist. I've taken our CRM, I've taken our synthetic CRM data. I want to emphasize this is completely manufactured data. This is not real data. And what I've asked it is, I want you to help me build a buyer persona based on all the characteristics of this data set, and
Okay.
tell me what the closed won deals have in common that they don't share with closed lost deals, so that I can try and figure out like who is my buyer. And I think particularly for companies that have a lot of data, this is a very valuable exercise to go through.
Mhm. We're always chasing like who that ideal customers, who are they? What do they want? What are they thinking? And the challenge was that without using a large language model is that we don't. necessarily gather enough information about someone in order to create that profile. And so I would imagine with the support and assistance of a large language model and some machine learning, data inference, we could actually start to build out, what we typically call personas, um, and those profiles, and then do different kinds of segmentation and get recommendations on what to do with that information.
Exactly. So what in this case the GPT-4 tool is doing is it is writing its own code to do that kind of analytics, to say like I need to understand the data set first. I need to build the appropriate code and then do things like these. It will suggest the statistical tests to run. Should you run a z-score? Should you run a chi-squared test? Should you run a logistic regression, and so on and so forth? And
Mhm.
again, I'm not going to spend a whole time, a lot of time going through this here, but that's one of the 6 use cases for analytics data with language models, is because tools like ChatGPT and Claude 2 to some extent can write their own code and test it
Mhm.
and make sure it works. You can have it do very sophisticated analysis of any tabular data. So CRM data, marketing automation data, Google Analytics data, you name it. If as long as it fits within the the allowed file size, you can have it do those experiments and then say, okay, well, who is our buyer? Like, what are there patterns in
Yeah.
the data that we just can't see, but the software could?
Uh,
What's my the where my brain is going with all of this is it's one more system to manage. And so I know there's a lot of connectors and a lot of companies that are building an interface on top of systems like ChatGPT. So, if you brought this to me, Chris, and said I can analyze our CRM data, my first question for you is like, okay, but where does that live? Do I have to keep going back and forth between the CRM and the large language model, or do we have a more centralized place to do this where I can, hit the magic buttons and say, reanalyze?
And this is where the governance portion of these tools, MarTech governance, because that's really what we're talking about, is so essential, because as you saw in the very, very quick demo, it's writing Python code. It is literally just writing Python code, and even a moderately skilled Python person could copy and paste the steps that it takes once it's done, assuming you're satisfied with the exploration, and you
Mhm.
then put that in production somewhere within your enterprise, and say, yeah, okay, now here's the data set. Now push the button, and it'll rerun
Mhm.
that entire analysis the next time through. So you don't have to have it. You don't have a person doing the interrogation. You can now have it become a part of your process and a part of your internal platform. And so that's where this goes from cool thought experiment to, okay, this is a usable processing system within our company.
And I think that that sort of like, when I think about generative AI still being a lot of a shiny object, those are the steps that aren't yet being taken by a lot of companies. Everything is still living and existing within the generative AI system. And so these use cases for analytics data, there's sort of that novelty of like, it's cool, I could do this thing. But people like me are asking questions like, but how do I streamline it? How do I make it so it's not yet one more piece of equipment in my tech stack?
Hmm. And to some degree, it is. I would say you think of it like your R&D lab almost, right? It is sort of your R&D lab where you test stuff out, and then once you find things that work, then you figure out, okay, what's the process internally to move those things into production.
Mhm. That makes sense. All right, so we talked about the CRM data, which I think is super useful, and you and I are going to catch up about that offline because I have a lot of questions and ideas. What's another use case that we are overlooking with our analytics data?
Extraction of data from other data sources is the
Hmm.
second one. So this is Claude's Anthropic's Claude. I'm uploading a PDF that contains a lot of tabular data. Now, anyone who's ever worked with PDFs knows getting data out of PDFs
Oh,
is a delight. And by a delight,
looking
I
at
mean
you,
awful.
academia.
And in fact, this is an academic paper. So
Shocker.
I've given it a prompt to say, I want you to try and extract the tables. Now, this prompt sometimes works, sometimes does not. Depends on the file and how Claude is feeling that day. But in this case, it is in fact actually extracting out several of the tables in a pipe delimited format. So if you
Huh.
have data that is locked away in a PDF, you can get extracts from it, which is again very helpful, very straightforward use case. But if you're sitting around with lots and lots of data, or one of my favorite use cases is maybe you have that person in your company who loves to make ridiculously complex Excel spreadsheets, and you just want a set of rows. I ran into this with some of the Warrior Nun stuff. One of my friends in that fandom has this very bizarre format for their data. I'm like, I just want a table, and this is broken up into all. You can give it to a tool like Claude or ChatGPT and say, please just extract this in a rectangular table.
I can also think of a lot of, to talk about offline, a lot of uses for that as well.
Yep.
This, as an aside, one of the things that makes me nuts are people who use Excel spreadsheets like Word docs.
Yes.
And then there's all this other stuff in the sheet, not just metrics. And then I can't sort it. I can't do it. I can't filter it because there's all these words and pictures. I'm like, this is a sheet. And so being able to translate that using one of these large language models is, for me, invaluable. Short of just slapping someone's hand and saying, don't touch that.
Exactly. The third use case is summarization. And this is something that I was absolutely lost without. And now it is something that is part of every month I do this in our reporting, and it saves me so much time. PowerPoint has, when you have like little call out boxes and notations and stuff in PowerPoint, those are actually data fields. And for the longest time, like, how do I get the text out of a PowerPoint document so I can make a good executive summary, not miss anything, and make some action items? And so I started doing a little bit of research. Then I'm like, I'm just going to ask ChatGPT, hey, what format is this in PowerPoint? And it turns out that because it's a big model, it knows what that format looks like. And so it wrote me some PowerPoint, some Python code to say, find all the text in this presentation and export it as a single text file. So I ran this recently on the Trust Insights SEO report, and of course it spits out all the notes that I made throughout, all little call out boxes throughout the presentation. And then I take that and I put it in a language model and say, summarize this into executive summary. And that's what you see every month when I share it internally. By the way, if you are interested in that Python code and you would like a copy of it, it is available if you go to our Analytics for Marketers Slack group. I shared it recently. I said, hey, here it is for anyone who wants it for free, but you got to be a member of Analytics for Marketers. You can go get it at trustinsights.ai/analytics for marketers.
How do you know it's writing Python code? Does it say this is Python code?
It does, and I also recognize the syntax.
Well, and so that's that, for someone like me, I would look at that and go, I don't know what this is. And so there's definitely a learning curve for using these large language models in some of these use cases. So, I would know who to ask, or I would know how to research what is it that I'm looking at. But for some people, if a large language model just starts writing code, they're going to look at it and go, I don't know what to do with this. Or is it just throwing, junk and errors at me? So it's interesting that this is the response that it's giving you. Like, so could I give it my data, my analytics from my CRM, and say, help me put together a solution that doesn't require writing code?
Maybe. That'd be tricky because
it's not accessible for everybody.
It's not accessible for everybody, but these tools are not mathematical tools. It's one of the misconceptions about them is they are language tools, hence the name large language model. And so they sort of sidestep their lack of mathematical skill by writing code, because code is still a language, and then it executes the code. So I would say in this particular use case, I mean, the easiest way to do that would be for us to turn it into a web app and then, offer it to clients and say, like, hey, if you want to use this, upload your PowerPoint presentation, we'll spit back the thing. And it'll be a web-based service instead of something that people would have to run locally if they don't have those technical capabilities in-house. And if you'd like to, let us know if this is a service that you would be willing to pay for. Hop in our Slack group, or let us know by going to trustinsights.ai/contact.
So that's an interesting, sort of pro tip, is that these large language models, the solution might be it's going to give you back pieces of code to then run. And so I think that's one of the misunderstandings, to your point, is one of the misunderstandings about how these large language models are putting together solutions for you. So we've talked about CRM data. We've talked about extraction, summarization. What were some of the other use cases that we are overlooking?
The third one is what I call transformation of data. So transformation of data is when you take existing data that you have and you ask for it to be converted into a different format, a format where you can ask it to interpret things. You can ask it to compare things. So here is an example. I'm going to paste in this relatively long prompt I have about Google Analytics data, and I have some Google Analytics session data in here, and I'm asking it to help take a look at it. So it's going to start doing the analysis. It's going to run essentially come up with the computations needed to compare these two periods in Google Analytics. I do appreciate the fact that it actually puts the mathematical formulas there, and it's going to spit out essentially its findings from our Google Analytics data, and then what recommendations it should make. So this is an example of a rewrite where we've given it existing data and we're asking it to rewrite that data in a different format, in this case as recommendations.
Interesting. And so it's going to go through this whole, code rewrite. And then for those listening, ChatGPT right now has taken what Chris has given and is rewriting the code, and is now, it looks like what it's now also giving us is the actual analysis of the code that it's written. And so it's an interesting way to look at it, because you didn't give ChatGPT code to start with. You said, this is the thing I want to do. Here's the data. So the solution that this large language model came up with was to write its own code in order to understand how to analyze the data in the way that you're asking.
Exactly. So in the observations, it says here, the direct traffic channel saw a significant decrease by 34%. This is a good sign, as this can mean that tagging has improved and there's better data quality. Organic search traffic increased slightly, which suggests that SEO efforts might be paying off. Organic social saw a drastic decrease of 46%. This may suggest that social media campaigns or content wasn't as effective in the current period, or there might be traffic coming from dark social, which isn't being tracked. Now, it's also going to start doing some campaign recommendations. So like for your email, segment the email list and target users based on preferences. Direct traffic, keep doing good tagging, and so on and so forth. Now these are pretty vanilla recommendations, but it's a good example of, I've got some data and maybe I need to write a report for my stakeholders and I'm just stuck, or maybe I didn't have that second cup of coffee that morning. This is a good starting point, a good first draft of what you could be doing in your analytics reporting.
And I think that's the key, is tools like ChatGPT and Claude are good jumping off places. They're good to help you get unstuck, but you shouldn't take this verbatim, paste it into a report and give it to your stakeholders, because to your point, Chris, it is very vanilla, because your business, your campaigns, your digital marketing is nuanced, and there's information in here. It's just looking at session data. So it doesn't know all of the other outside factors as to why your session data may be. So, for example, it said that organic social was down. I can tell you exactly why that is. It doesn't know the reason, but I know the reason why organic social is down. If this were our data, I would say because we have pulled back resources for posting on social, that we still use organic social, but not in the way that we were 6 months ago, 12 months ago. And so that's information that this system doesn't know.
Yeah, this is actually not our data. This is from the Warrior Nun campaign. But yes, exactly.
But it's as an example, like I could say, I know why referral traffic is down, but this system wouldn't necessarily know.
Exactly. And that's context that you can and should provide in your prompts.
Mhm.
That's an important part. The next example is classification. So this is taking data and classifying. So I have here a bunch of synthetic reviews from a Norwegian restaurant. Hang on here. I need to get the file loaded. Reviews. There we go.
And so where do you load the data in these systems? Is it through uh oh,
Right at
so
the
this
bottom
is
there.
Claude. Okay.
This is Claude.
So
There's a little attachments button.
but there isn't an attachment button in ChatGPT.
There is if you use Code Interpreter. So the regular
Wow.
ChatGPT does not have that. The Code Interpreter does. But Code
And
Interpreter
that's the
can
paid
only
version?
yes. And
Mhm.
Code Interpreter can only take tabular data, CSV files, text files, etc. So it can't take in like images or movies or things like that. So here we have Claude's assessment of 5,000 records. These are customer reviews for the Arendelle Cafe, mixed rating of 2.9, strengths, authentic Norwegian cuisine, weaknesses, inconsistency in food service, recommendations, improved training for wait staff. Customer reviews, customer feedback, voice of the customer stuff. This is analytics data that we typically have in abundance, but because it's typically unstructured, we don't use it. I mean, Katie, you and I have talked about this with many clients saying, like, you're collecting the data. You've got an
Mhm.
email inbox that's overflowing with customer feedback and you're not using it. Why not? And the
Right.
answer is we don't know how. Now there's a way.
I'm thinking of a couple of our clients who we should probably proactively do this for, because those are the questions of like, why are people, not subscribing or signing up or giving us money? Well, we have a lot of that information as to why.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. You'll recall a few years ago, we had to build an incredibly complicated network graphing system to help one of our clients identify potential new products in the marketplace
Mhm.
using some of their data. That project took 3 months just to write the code for it and to get it working. I could do the same project today in about 25 minutes with a language model because for that particular data, that data is language itself. It's the customer's words. A language model is the right solution for that. It's much better than what we came up with back then because this wasn't available to us back then.
Mhm.
You're giving me a lot of ideas today.
Oh, good. That means more work. And the last category is question answering. And again, this is where once you've got the data set in here, you can start asking questions of it. So you can say, what significant anomalies do you see in the data? Are there particular standout extremes that are worth analyzing further? And the critical thing to remember about question answering when you're question answering with a language model is you don't need to have technical subject matter expertise. You just have to have your business subject matter expertise. So if you are the cafe owner and people are complaining that the Geitost, the Brunost is not fresh, and you know that it takes 2.5 months to get it shipped from Norway to your restaurant, you're like, okay, that's a complaint, but I can't do anything about that, right? Because so I can't address that problem. So you would have subject matter expertise of your business. You have so here it's going through the synthetic. Now, the reason it's coming up with these anomalies is because this is completely synthetic data. So it's reused the code I used to generate it reused the same names for a lot of things. So that's expected. But this shows, I think this is important. The duplicate reviews by Hiroshi, lack of responses to some bad reviews, and contradictory details in others point to some amount of review manipulation or fabrication. Okay, so now if you are a B2C company, maybe you've got a product on Amazon, you've got 5,000 reviews, maybe you can start analyzing, going, are we being review bombed? Are we being manipulated by a competitor or something? If you are a consumer, even you could take the reviews on a product and you're like, how many of these reviews are real? If there's a product, if there's a big ticket product you're thinking of buying, like maybe this would be a useful technique to understand that.
It's interesting you bring that up because as a consumer, I always look at reviews for bigger ticket items, and a lot of them feel planted by the company themselves, or I know I've seen, the side hustle, make $1,000, reviewing Amazon products for now. Like, okay, but how did you get your hands on all those products in order to review them? Like, there's a lot of, you know, buyer beware lessons that, regular people who aren't running businesses could be using these large language models for just for their own research.
So let's ask, is there evidence that these reviews might be faked or made by the company? So let's look at the text of the reviews, because I think that's, if you're going to spend $2,000 or $3,000 on a big ticket item, you might want to know that.
Mhm.
And you don't necessarily need to have a fancy scraper or anything like that. If you've got enough of a suspicion, you could just copy and paste into a text document, page after page. It would take you a little while, but if it
Mhm.
takes you 15 minutes to copy and paste a bunch of reviews, but it could save you $3,000 on a mistake, that seems like it's something
Mhm.
to be worth doing. And then, of course, you can load that into a system like Claude or ChatGPT and just ask it, "Hey, tell me about the language of these reviews." Here it's saying, um, "Overwhelming praise and many five-star reviews without any critique. Most genuine reviews will mix good and bad points, even if overall positive." Right?
Mhm.
Details like menu items, chef's dedication, kids loving pancakes seems like inside knowledge of the restaurant operation rather than average customers' experience.
No.
Now, of course, again, this is a synthetic this data set,
Right,
so
but
it
it's like,
is.
"Oh, that does make a lot of sense." Like, how would someone who only went there once know this?
Mhm. Occasional awkward phrasing also hints at non-native marketing writers rather than genuine customers. I think
Mhm.
there's some really interesting language in here. Um, Pattern of specific menu item pairs described as amazing combinations, like lefse plus jam plus smoked salmon. Most customers wouldn't necessarily know or care about these pairings unless suggested. So again, you could
But
decompose a lot of content out there and go, huh, is there something suspicious about that? So these are the 6 big use cases for large language models with analytics data. And I think it's really important to reiterate, your analytics data is the backbone of your operations.
yeah.
It is your decision-making tools. These language models and their interfaces give you, particularly if you are a non-technical, non-data marketer, a window into asking your data the questions you want answers to.
Like that. I like it. And I think, the, thing to reiterate is having an understanding, having an expertise in your business is important when asking these questions because you need to know if the responses you're getting are valid or not, or are worth, you know, digging deeper into. Um, because if you just hand it a data set that you know nothing about, yeah, it's going to give you information, but how do you know whether it's valid or not? So, if I'm looking at data on the plumbing industry, well, I'm not a plumber. I don't work within that industry. So I have no idea if, the cost of valves going up or down is a good thing.
Exactly. Um, but you can also use the tools, and we've talked about this in past episodes, as professional development tools. If you need to get up to speed on something, on a particular subject, you can absolutely use them for that, to have you almost tutor you in a way of
Mhm.
exploring. Okay, this is how this thing works. This is what this concept is about. Is this valve in plumbing important? What's the supply of it? I saw on the news this morning there's a significant shortage of rice on the planet right now, for a whole bunch of reasons. And if you're an economist, that makes sense, and you can see the big picture. If you are not an economist, you might not know what that means, but you can ask a language model, "Hey, I saw this analytics data about
Mhm.
world supply of rice. What does this mean for me? What should I be doing about it? Thinking about it? How should this affect my grocery purchases? Will I see other things at the store increase in price? If you're a business owner, like, how will that change your business?" That seemingly, you know, agricultural product will affect trust insights in some way, because the price of consumer staples means that there's less money consumers have to spend elsewhere, which means they spend less money with their vendors. Those vendors in turn spend less money with their vendors, and that eventually works its way through the supply chain to companies like us, who are like, okay, it could turn out that rice shortage could have a spillover effect on 2 quarters from now, when companies are like, yeah, we got our budgets cut.
Mhm. Butterfly effect.
It is. And the thing about language models, particularly the big ones like GPT-4, is they can see through our language a very, very big picture of the world and draw those connections that we can't. And it's why it's so powerful to use these with our
Yeah.
analytics data.
I like it. I like it. I have a lot of thoughts and questions and ideas. So, get your pen out or get your Otter transcriber out for our next conversation.
I certainly will. And the summary of these use cases, we actually have them written down along with the prompts. If you would like them, again, go to our free Slack group, go to trustinsights.ai/analytics for marketers. We'll put it in there. And you and 3,300 other marketers can ask and answer each other's questions all day long about analytics, also about AI. We're always happy to have folks having conversations. And also things like, whether pineapple belongs on pizza or not. The answer is yes, by the way.
It does not. Nope. You will never change my mind.
And wherever it is that you watch or listen to the show, if there's a channel you would rather have it on instead, you can find it at trustinsights.ai/TI podcast, where we are on most channels. Thanks for tuning in, and we will talk to you next time.